Hey there, friends, and welcome to the Take 3 Theological Variety Hour! Yay! We are heading into... Yay! We are heading into episode 11. And I am going to say that this is the first part of our Dish on Death. But I don't think it's going to be that... Really? It wasn't that funny. But I don't
It was.
think
Can you do that again?
I promise I will do it at the beginning of every death episode. But okay. For you right now, the Dish on Death. He's so easily amused. I love it.
I didn't know you were going to do that.
So we're talking about death, and yet we're sitting here all giggling. And death is most certainly a serious subject. And I think actually our next parts on death may be a little bit more touchy than this, because at some point we're going to talk about how death affects those of us who are still living. So discussing people who have passed on, and concepts of heaven and hell and all of that. But this episode, we decided to start with the question of where do we go after we die? So we're going to start with Seth, who is going to talk about one part of where we go after we die in Catholic theology. And then we are going to move on to Christine, who is going to be our heresy of the week. Oh, Christine is the heresy of the week, like in herself.
Yeah. Yes, I am. That is absolutely true.
The title of the heresy is Christine.
Yes.
And then finally, we are going to come on a journey with me to talk about a couple different episodes and change the question of where we're going to how we are going into our deaths. So I'm going to turn it over to Seth, who is going to regale us with stories of purgatory.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening. So just a little bit of background. My master's thesis is on purgatory. So sort of like a big deal for me. When you think about purgatory, I want you to think about me. And another thing about purgatory, aside that I think it's really rad, is that I feel like a lot of people don't really understand it. I know that if I hadn't gone out of my way to research purgatory for my master's thesis, that I wouldn't probably have the greatest understanding of it either. And a story that really brought that home to me is I was sitting in this spirituality meeting with a lot of people who were a lot older than me. It was a group of us, and then the person leading the spirituality meeting was a sister. And somehow purgatory came up because I think it was in the book we were reading, like it was mentioned in the book. And one of the people in the meeting was like, yeah, we don't believe in purgatory anymore, right? And the sister was like, yeah, we do. So anyway, I feel like people think that that's like sort of this medieval devotion, and that maybe, I don't know, maybe that after the Reformation, it's just not a thing anymore. It is definitely a thing, and it's still an official belief of the church. Anyway, to get into, we could talk a lot about purgatory, and I have, but I just wanted to give some background, because my thesis on purgatory is historical, and specifically my interest in purgatory was how women mystics dealt with purgatory in the 13th century, because it was a very important topic to them then. But in writing this thesis, I learned a lot about purgatory, like I said, and the church has kind of had a development in ideas of purgatory. So it didn't fall out of the sky like, we believe in purgatory and this is what it is. The teaching of the church on purgatory actually was not codified until the 13th century. It was at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274 that the church made an official statement. What, Christine?
Can I interrupt? Just so it wasn't codified until that point, but were there ideas floating around before then, and then that was just when it was sort of really set down?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So what I want to go over as briefly as possible without getting too sidetracked is just to kind of go over that timeline. So we have in the Bible stories that suggest purgatory. So for one, the book of Maccabees talks about praying for the dead. And then there's the story of the rich man and Lazarus. So kind of ancient beliefs about, first of all, ancient beliefs about what happens after we die, like Jewish beliefs about what happens after we die, were not uniform either. So there's this idea of no really afterlife at all. There's also this idea of the bosom of Abraham, which appears in the story about the rich man and Lazarus. The first Christian writing, aside from the Bible, about something analogous to purgatory is from the 2nd century, and it's a text called the Apocalypse of Peter, which talks about, what happens to souls after they die. And actually, I forgot that I even wrote about this in my thesis. I'm looking it over again. Clement of Alexandria, Erica's boy, talks about a purifying fire that tries souls and devours anything that's, he says, vulgar about them. So this idea of purgatory is that it's, first of all, okay, so I'm kind of all over the place. What I've heard people say about purgatory is that it's like this kind of transitional place where you can either go to heaven or go to hell. That is not the case at all. Purgatory, the belief about purgatory is that it is a place of preparation for souls to eventually enter heaven. So it's not like an elevator that goes up and down. If you're in purgatory, you are bound eventually to go to heaven. Hell is not in the equation. So what these early writers like Clement of Alexandria and also Augustine talk about is that purgatory is less of a place than like a spiritual state. And it's a state where anything that would keep you from experiencing heaven fully is purged, is burned away. And they talk about it as a purifying fire in many cases. So that's how Clement talks about it. Tertullian also speaks about purgatory. So he kind of moves toward purgatory as being an actual place. And he calls it the refrigerium interim, which is sort of like a place of refreshment, which is kind of analogous to the bosom of Abraham that's talked about in the Bible. So it's sort of like
it's like a powder room.
Kind of. It's like okay. where you go. Yeah. Well, I mean, guys don't have that, but
So are we saying that there are only women in purgatory?
Women and babies.
Well, you're talking about bosoms, so it only follows.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and then there's the limbo of the fathers, so it's very like sexually.
No limbo. No. We'll get to limbo. No.
All right. Limbo is a part of hell, by the way. Anyway, so what Tertullian, this is a quote about the quote-unquote bosom of Abraham from Tertullian. He says, although it is not heaven, it is higher than hell, and is appointed to afford an interval of rest to the souls of the righteous until the consummation of their reward. So Tertullian seems to think of this place being somewhere that souls go until the final judgment, which is very different than the idea of purgatory. So, all right. After Tertullian, also in North Africa, we have Augustine, who talks about kind of a place, not necessarily a place, but again, kind of a spiritual state where anything that, is sinful is burned away. Another thing that I reference in my thesis that is maybe a little bit, out there about traditions of purgatory, but Perpetua, the North African martyr, talks about purgatory or something analogous to purgatory. So Perpetua had visions, and she had sort of like these dream visions with which in early Christianity were taken as kind of authoritative, like prophetic. And there's scholarship that links Perpetua kind of to this Marcionite heresy, but we won't go into that. But kind of dream visions were seen to be sent by God to Christians, and they had prophetic, authoritative significance. So one of these dreams that Perpetua has is about her younger brother Dinocrates, who dies as a child, and she sees him in this dream in this place where he's suffering. And then she prays for him. After she has this dream, she prays for him. So again, that tradition of prayers for the dead. And in the next dream she has, he is happy and not suffering anymore. So people have pointed to this, and I point to this in my thesis, as being kind of a proto-purgatory type of understanding. Because really, what it comes down to really simplify this, is that Christians and Jews have a tradition of praying for the dead. So what would be the point of doing that unless there was some place that souls were in need of prayers? Souls that are in hell don't need any prayers because they can't go anywhere. Except there's two instances I can think of where saints were able to pull souls out of hell, aside, of course, from, the harrowing of hell that Christ, descended into hell. But again, that idea of Christ descending into hell is more of the bosom of Abraham idea, the refrigerium interim, where these, the patriarchs that were mentioned in the Old Testament were in this place, and they couldn't go to heaven yet because, the incarnation hadn't happened. So then Christ goes and gets them out of this powder room, as Erica would say. For the dead is really what drives the construction, you might say, of purgatory. So by the Middle Ages, when Cluny, the monks at Cluny, begin to say offices for the dead, then you really kind of get a ramp up of ideas about like All Souls Day, Day of the Dead, which becomes associated with Day of the Dead in the Americas. And then the holy women that I write about see the ministry to souls in purgatory as like something that they feel really strongly about, and something that they can do and have authority to do, even though they can't, they don't have authority really on earth, but they have authority in purgatory because of their close relationship with Christ. They are able to pray for souls and get them out of purgatory. So you have a lot of this literature from the Middle Ages, from the 13th century, especially 12th and 13th century, where these holy women have visions of purgatory. One particular mystic or visionary, Christina Mirabilis, actually goes to purgatory. Her story is really crazy. She allegedly died, and then this angel takes her on a tour of purgatory and hell, and then she miraculously comes back to life. And as the priest is saying her funeral mass, she like jumps up out of her coffin and then flies up into the rafters of the church, and they have to coax her down with the Holy Eucharist. So and then for the rest of Christina's life, she basically subjects herself to these really wild and extreme penances because of this experience that she had in purgatory. She, offers these penances for the souls that she saw suffering there. Yeah, so that's kind of like a very quick and dirty development of the idea. It goes from this idea of a place of kind of a liminal place between, life and the final judgment, to a spiritual state where the sins that we commit in our lives, need to be burned away in some way, to, by the Middle Ages, it is a very specific localized place. Thomas Aquinas in the supplementum of the Summa Theologiae talks about a specific place for purgatory. He actually says that it's a part of hell, which I think is problematic. And
since I do so much Aquinas, maybe that's why I don't care for purgatory, is because that's mostly what I have read.
Yeah, and
I find it problematic too, though.
I think it's problematic that he says that it's part of hell. And what's really interesting about that is the first place that I really kind of got interested in purgatory is Dante's Divine Comedy. And Dante pretty much parrots Thomas Aquinas's theology. He's very influenced by Aquinas. But Dante kind of goes in the other direction. Hell is, a very specific place for him, and purgatory is a very specific place for him, and they are not the same place. And Dante's whole push in the second book of the Divine Comedy about purgatory is that it is a place that's suffused with love, because all those souls that are in purgatory have this goal, eventual goal of going to heaven. So they're suffering, but they are joyous because it's a step towards the beatific vision. So the way that Dante writes about purgatory, I think, is probably some of the best writing there is about it. And I don't necessarily know if that counts as theology, but it's definitely been.
I think it certainly counts as a lot of the popular imagination and the root of what a lot of people think. Although in this case, I think, Seth, you've actually identified the root of a lot of things that I've seen around in the contemporary years that I think have their root in Aquinas, and I take issue with them. I'd probably take issue with Aquinas. You were talking about the earlier ideas, and Tertullian, yeah, I'm totally on board with that idea. But I think the root of what I take issue with might start or be around Aquinas, now that you've brought that up.
Yeah, and why don't you just maybe start talking about that? And I mean, if I need to throw anything else in, I can. But I just wanted to give kind of a rough overview, so I think maybe now we can go into your part where you're maybe considering more contemporary ideas about it.
Okay, I am happy to do so. But thank you for that. I always love getting the historical development of ideas, because it's always so fascinating how things have changed over 2,000 years, sometimes in ways that I overall agree with, and in this case, ways that I don't overall agree with. And this, for me, starts with several years ago, I read a book, and I think it was called Hungry Souls, Visions and Experiences of people coming back from purgatory to warn the living, which is an unfortunate title for someone who's well enough versed in Japanese mythology to know about hungry ghosts, which are a very interesting. Japan has a lot of peculiar mythology, but the hungry ghosts, which end up as the hollows in Bleach later on, are always interesting. But back to purgatory. So a lot of the what I was reading about purgatory, and a lot of what you'll run across in a lot of current year Catholic talk about purgatory is things like purgatory is basically hell, except it has an eventual end. That purgatory is, I've seen it described as worse than hell, which is, honestly, people, if you ever hear that, just do me a favor, roll your eyes as hard as you possibly can, take a selfie with whoever just said that, send it to us here, and we'll start a collection, because the whole point of hell...
Shaming.
Huh?
Purgatory shaming.
That's right. The whole idea of hell is there is nothing worse. So yeah, don't buy into that. But there's this idea of, and when people will talk, try to evangelize about purgatory, they will say that the need for purgatory is that even if you have repented of all your sins, that it is the place where God's justice is satisfied, where his justice and his mercy are satisfied. So that if you did a lot of shady or evil things while you were alive that you had not fully paid penance for, that is what purgatory is for. And I take great issue to that idea, both the idea that purgatory is basically torture that eventually has an end, and the idea that it has to do that it is a penance and a satiation of God's vengeful, wrathful justice. I have grave concerns over these ideas. The root of the idea, so I guess Seth talked about what Aquinas said. I would roll into that. There's two things that seem to be forgotten or misread, that sort of metastasize into what I think is this, I would say, erroneous idea of purgatory. The first is that God is a vengeful, wrathful deity. And God can be vengeful. God says quite clearly that vengeance is his. God can be wrathful. We talk about the day of wrath all over the Bible. But the idea that is the basis of God's relationship with humans, which you see pop up across Christian history, in the Catholic faith, outside of the Catholic faith, it's erroneous. It starts, I think, with an erroneous reading of Genesis in chapter 3, where Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, like high school students who pissed off mom and dad one too many times. But it's really a misreading, because if you actually look at what happens when God has confronted Adam and Eve after everything, and he said, well, you ate the fruit, this is what's going to happen. There's this idea that then they are literally booted out of the nice paradise into the cold, uncaring world, and it's just this wrathful occurrence. But if you read it, God says, okay, it's time for you to go, and here's these things that are going to happen, and you can't stay here in paradise. But he takes a moment and he makes them garments of skin, and for Adam and his wife, and clothes. The passage is, this is chapter 3, verse 21. The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. He didn't miracle them up. He didn't just precipitate them out of the ether of paradise. There are some translations where it's translated to be a little more clear that God actually slaughters animals and crafts clothes for them out of leather. This is tough clothing. This is very much a moment where, sort of like something out of the Legend of Zelda, God says, wow, it's dangerous to go out there just clothed in fig leaves. Here, take this. And he makes them your class 1 D&D armor, your leather armor. Leather is tough, whether it's rawhide, whether it's been cured. If God makes for them clothing made out of leather and doesn't just miracle it up, he shows them the whole process, from slaughtering the animal to tanning the hide. All of this involves learning some basic physics, learning some basic biochemistry. There's the implication here that God isn't just kicking them out in a snit. He's actually saying, okay, this is what you've chosen, but it's going to be rough. So let me show you a few things to get you started on your way. So I don't see, so this whole idea that God has just been enraged with humanity ever since Eden, that's erroneous. Second, the idea that God's justice needs to be satisfied by us paying penance. Yes, while we're on earth, penitence is absolutely required. Doing penance to do what we can to make right what we have wronged, to fix what we have broken as far as we can, to heal the wound in the world or in the person that we have caused. These are very important. However, of course, once you're dead, you're dead. And in that, the act of reparation is either to the world or to your fellow human, or even to yourself, depending on the nature of the sin for which you are repenting. But if we're talking about paying penitence toward God, after a certain point, I have to say or ask, well, what was the point of the crucifixion? Because the whole point, what we learn all through the Old Testament is humans can't do it. We can't. We can try our hardest. We cannot perfectly satisfy God. Part of the whole point, to my understanding of the crucifixion, was Christ, Jesus, was the only perfect sacrifice, the only perfect atonement, the only thing that could be offered to God as that perfect penitence, and all the rest of us have to accept that. Now, that doesn't mean we get to lay back on our laurels and say, oh, Christ did everything, we don't have to worry about anything at all. Far from that. But it is saying that it's not a situation where we have to satisfy God's justice, because Jesus already did. If Jesus did not, if we still have to satisfy his justice, then that to me implies that the crucifixion was for nothing. And I find that horribly offensive and troublesome. And that's why I have a problem with a lot of what you'll see out there in sort of popular Catholic teachings, popular Catholic blogs, or pundits who will say that purgatory is a place where even if you've repented, you still have to satisfy some justice. I'm in favor of purgatory overall, the concept of it. And I'm very much in favor of those early thoughts that Seth was talking about. Myself, I've thought of it as sort of like rehab. You go in and you've got some work to do, and it's not going to be comfortable. It's not necessarily going to be the best weeks of your life, right? There's going to be withdrawal. There's going to be, just like you go in to a rehab clinic with all your addictions. If you're going into hell, sin, and a lot of sin is addiction. So you're going to go be cleaned and purged of those addictions. That's not necessarily going to be a fun time, but it's going to be good. And just like on earth, there may be some fasting involved, there's going to be the withdrawal involved, and at the end, things are going to be much better. And yes, having people pray for you, like when you're in rehab, having people on the outside praying for you can only help. Help you get through your withdrawal faster, help you purge all the, whether it's evil chemicals or evil sins, get rid of that. And I think that's to my view, that's a much healthier way of viewing purgatory. We're not quite ready for heaven yet. We've still got certain attachments that we need to learn to let go of. We have certain addictions that we need to go through the rehab program for. It's not hell with an end. It's let's get fixed. Let's heal these wounds so that we can bear heaven. And there was one saint, and it might have been Hildegard, but I'm not certain. So certainly correct me if I'm wrong. But I recall one saint who actually described purgatory, and who actually said that basically hell and purgatory and heaven were the same place. It was all the same experience. The difference was in the soul and what the soul was how the soul experienced it. So the soul that was fully healed and just fully in the right place experience the fire of God's love as just awesomeness, things that are beyond human words for how great they are. The soul in the state of purgatory was having those impurities burned off. And so it was still on, the fire of God's love was still uncomfortable, but it was good. Whereas the soul that was in the state of hell, who had rejected God and rejected the fire of God's love, just found it awful. And I don't know if I'd go quite that far, because I see hell as the absence of God. But it's an interesting thought that at least that purgatory and heaven, in terms of place, might be the same place. It's just, it's sort of like when you first step into a really hot bath and it stings and it hurts, but then you get acclimated and it's really great. And maybe that's just the microcosm of the concept of purgatory and heaven, that one is you haven't gotten acclimated yet. You're still burning off the impurities. You're still going through rehab. So that's really what I wanted to say. You're going to see a lot of things out on the internet talking about purgatory as basically either hell with an end or hell light or temporarily even worse than hell. I don't know that I would necessarily go with that. And I don't know that, I guess I'd have to check with the Catechism to see how, quote, authoritative that view is. But I would say you don't have to, and especially with what Seth said about the history. That is, you don't have to believe in the hell with an end version of purgatory. But do understand that purgatory is a mercy. Like, it absolutely is. It is the Tertullian's idea, Seth, that you just gave us of the resting place. I'm like, that, yeah, that's great. You need somewhere to catch your breath, and just collect yourself. And yeah. I really like that. Why do we not see more of that idea around? Or if someone floats it, I've seen people float an idea of a purgatory that isn't hell. And I've seen like esteemed Catholic pop theologians shoot them down. And just
really?
be like, it's anyway.
Well,
so
I guess what I wanted to get across is that, this idea, whatever it is, I feel like my story at the beginning, I think a lot of people just ignore this idea of purgatory now, or think that we quote unquote don't believe in it anymore. But what I wanted to show is that, very, very much like what you said, Christine, and I actually love that idea of rehab that you used. But that there was a diversity of thought, and that the earliest thought is that it's kind of this spiritual preparation place versus, a specific like place somewhere full of fire where people are, burning in flames and everything. And definitely the development went there. And by the Middle Ages, you pretty much, the scholastic idea is that it's a very specific place, and that I just actually found this quote from Bonaventure, who, usually Bonaventure has this beautiful theology, but this is what he says about purgatory. One is punished not so severely as to be deprived of hope and of the knowledge that they are not in hell. But Bonaventure doesn't think purgatory is hell. He thinks it's a very specific, different place. Although, he continues, by reason of the intensity of the pain, they may at times be unaware of it. So he's saying that the intensity of pain in purgatory is so much that you can forget that it's actually a hopeful place. And I think that's really problematic, but that's kind of where the discussion went, especially in the Middle Ages. Just to briefly go back to Christina Mirabilis, when she goes to purgatory, she looks at the angel and she's like, whoa, why'd you bring me to hell? Because purgatory is so awful in her vision of it that she thought it was hell. So it's like, in the Middle Ages, that's definitely like the route they went. This is this really horrible place. It's just like hell, but it's over at some point. So I definitely see your criticism of it, Christine. And I think that if you really look at how the idea developed, it is a helpful idea. It is a good idea. It's, this interim place where you need to prepare spiritually for what's to come.
Yeah.
And one other thing that I wanted to say, it's a very related topic, is the idea of like victim souls, like, which always really makes me uncomfortable, but like it gets to what you were saying, Christine, about these people who seem to talk about, the crucifixion like it didn't mean anything. Last year I did a presentation at a conference about Lidwine of Skedom, who is another kind of 14th century holy woman. But Huysmans, the author Huysmans, writes about Lidwine, who is kind of one of these victim souls. She suffered terribly during her life and, offered it to Christ for, Huysmans talks about victim souls and Lidwine being one of them as these people who have to exist on Earth because otherwise Earth would like fall into chaos. And it's like, if these people weren't there suffering for the world, and it's like, well, what did Jesus mean? If, like, who are these people, and what does Jesus mean if you think that? So I was very troubled when I was preparing for that presentation.
I mean, like, in general, I do appreciate, one of the things I appreciate about Catholic teaching is in general the teaching on suffering, and that suffering and pain can have meaning and it can have purpose. And honest, like, I used to, back when we were in college, when people would say, something would be rubbing me wrong and people would say, oh, offer it up, that I would just roll my eyes. And I still kind of do, because I think it's too easy it's easy for people to say. We'll put it that way. We'll get into that some other time. But I do think that sometimes it goes too far. It's one thing if just life is hard, crap happens, and offering that up in patience and, as a display of faith to the Lord. The idea of victim souls, it basically makes people your whipping boy or whipping girl, or divine whipping child. And that's just, there's a certain level of sadism involved in that I find very disturbing.
Well, and I think there's a difference between acceptance of a hard life and having it be part of God's plan. In terms of you have to suffer, you're meant to suffer. I think those are two different things. So I agree with you.
Okay, so here when we were setting up this show, texting back and forth, I was like, oh no, are Seth and I gonna have a showdown? We're gonna fight? But I'm glad we didn't actually have to fight about this, Seth. I'm happy.
We were brought together by Purgatory.
Oh, I can't.
That needs to be a hashtag, brought together by Purgatory. In fact, I might make that into a t-shirt, Seth. I like that.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so Erica, what do you have for us?
Okay, so I'm going to be the black sheep of the family. I'm not going to talk to you about Purgatory. I'm not going to talk to you about where we're going. Seth and Christine did a great job of discussing where people might go in the afterlife from a theological perspective.
Really did.
You did. Kudos to you. So we're going to continue, like I said, to talk about other places, as above, so below. Oh my. In future parts of our...
Wait, are you pulling out the emerald tablet of Thoth on us? Are we going full scale? I didn't bring any of my books, Erica.
Oh, so funny.
I was not ready for hardcore Hermeticism this week.
We're such nerds. So
future. I thought you were talking about that movie where the people go to a party in the catacombs and then they get stuck.
That movie is terrifying if you do not like small places. Other than that, it was pretty pathetic. But if you're not into getting squished into places, don't watch that movie. So yeah, more to come on Dish on Death. So for my part, in this little talk on death, I am not going to ask where we're going, but more of the human side of things. I'm going to change the question to how do we go? So my own truth, and part of the reason that I wanted to talk about death, was that I can honestly tell you I have no damn clue what comes after we die. Not with any certainty. In I'm Catholic from birth, though I'll admit that I didn't really find my feet in my Catholic life until late in high school. And despite almost 20 years of studying theology, I still find the afterlife very uneasy. What does heaven look like? Purgatory, where is everybody? Nothing ever seems like a good enough answer. So instead of focusing on what the afterlife looks like, however, I find it helpful for myself to look at how we end our lives. Death is most often than not shrouded in anxiety and fear, and why not? The leaving of everything that we know and journeying into the unknown naturally inflames all of our insecurities. But does it have to? Could we die better? And that's a funny thing to say, because when we reflect on doing things better, we look at elements of our lives that are favorable, like work, hobbies, talents. But it would be unfair to us as living beings to ignore honoring the time that we have put into our lives as we journey beyond into all of this big unknown stuff. So I don't want to focus on cliches either. Death is a part of life. The journey continues on. We'll see you on the other side. Certainly I find truths in these, so that's not what I'm saying. But I don't want to sugarcoat or feed you platitudes of comfort either, because I don't find truth in those things. So as a side note, when I'm speaking about dying, I'm not talking about sudden unexpected deaths, such as accidents or tragic deaths. I'm not talking about suicides. I believe that each of those kind of deserve its own discussion entirely. I'm really speaking to those who know that death will come for them soon, but they are still living. I also don't want to discuss bucket lists or last hurrahs, and not because I find these inappropriate or ill-thought ideas. I don't, but rather because they're popular ideas, and I think you can find a lot of information lurking around every corner on these topics. Certainly bucket lists in the past decade for me have become very, very popular all over the internet. So I'm going to delve into two examples, one religious and faith-based and one not. And they do come from pop culture. Yay! Because Erica loves her pop culture.
Are they rated R?
They are
just going to ask.
They are not rated R.
Oh, come on.
There is no R-isms in these. So first, we're going to go to the one that's not faith-based. And I think that it's purposeful to start with this one, and I'll get to why. So we're going to talk about an episode of The Magicians. It's a sci-fi show. I like the book, but I love the series. And I think it's partially because the actors and actresses in the series have really made it come to life. So the particular episode is called A Day in the Life. And it's season 3, episode 5. It is readily available on Amazon Prime for $2.99. And you can buy the single episode, so you don't have to buy the whole series. And I'm just going to take you through some of the episode to kind of give you a feel of what's happening. It is kind of a mystical episode. It's a mystical show, and there's magic and dragons and everything you could possibly think of. Think of like a slightly more R-rated, yes, Tolkien novel. So 2 characters, if you go to 11 and 43 seconds, sorry, my son is beguiling me with a kitty cat, but he is going to go and find some quiet time. Okay. So if you go to 11 minutes and 43 seconds, the 2 characters in question in this episode are Quentin and Elliot. And they are on a mission right now, a quest to find keys to save magic, to save the world, because it's always about saving the world. And they go to this place called Fillory, similar to Narnia, think Narnia, where magic has returned. So they're having a really hard time finding magic, though, and in this series, they keep losing magic. Anyways, so watch the series. You'll find more about that. But in order to complete this particular quest, they come to a large puzzle, and they have to complete this puzzle. And it's a huge, huge area with tiles that they have to put together. And as Quentin sits down to calculate the number of tiles and see all of the fractals that are possible to be made by these tiles, Elliot says to him, "Seriously, you're trying to calculate the beauty of all life." And so that was their quest. They had to find, somehow in this puzzle, the beauty of all life. So fast forward to 18 minutes, 45 seconds, and they begin to argue about the absurdity of this difficult puzzle and the task of finding the beauty of all life. How is that possible? And they can't use their magic. Even though there's a lot of magic around them, they can't use it. So they have their brains and they have each other, and that's it. And so it goes on, and it's on and off. It's a back and forth between them and another scene. But as the days continue on and they're unraveling as they're trying to do this puzzle, because there are almost infinite permutations, they try. They keep working, and they're 14 days in. And life is continuing. Day after day, they're doing the puzzle. But in reality, much more is happening. Elliot and Quentin are beginning to see the inevitable truth that this is now their life. They are stuck doing this puzzle together. And sometimes they fight. They fight doing the puzzle. They fight each other. But it's a very interesting relationship between the two. So finally, an irritated Elliot says to an irritated Quentin, we can't just throw away all this time we've invested. You want to live your life, live it here. As time goes on, Quentin falls in love with Ariel, a local girl. They kiss. They have a little boy, not from the kiss, but we'll get into that another time, how that works. The little boy was not from the kiss. Elliot remains a stalwart companion, friend of the family. And then as Ariel eventually dies. And Quentin is rather young and his son is young. So Quentin is heartbroken and death takes its toll. Elliot ends up taking care of both of them. And eventually Quentin's son, as he grows up, leaves home. And Quentin and Elliot have aged considerably. So the change that they're seeing, they're laying down the puzzle, not with young hands now, with arthritic hands and white beards. And 28 minutes into the story, an elderly Quentin finds a crinkly, peaceful Elliot has died by the puzzle in the spot where they were working for the rest of their lives. Quentin buries Elliot, finds a golden tile and piece as he digs and places it on the puzzle and finds the key. Quentin says, "We solved it together." So they fight and they love and they work and they sleep and they hope and they dream and they feel sadnesses and they die. Elliot didn't necessarily prepare for his death. There was no plan, no parting words. There was no high Hollywood drama. His body simply stopped in the same place that they had been working by this puzzle. And so when we look at this, I'm going to assume here that Elliot knew his time was coming. He was an elderly man, a very elderly man. And this is the time of people's lives where their body stops naturally. We don't have immortal lives. And unlike Quentin and his worrying, Elliot, if we look back, was always focused on life. Confused? I was talking about how we die, and now I'm talking about life. Yes, exactly. For some, the way that they conquer death is simply to focus on living. They don't let the dark mists of death bleed into the space of their life. There is a clear demarcation for the self. Remember Elliot's words to Quentin, live life here. Elliot died by living. Finding the beauty of all life was not in completing the puzzle. It was never about the puzzle. It was in completing their lives, in the living and the dying. So Elliot went into his unknown armed with a life of full knowing. Death for him was not this anxiety-filled, this draining, epic monument to conquer. It was simply bringing his life with him as his body gave out. And if you haven't seen the episode, it's actually even there's an article on Gizmodo that I will link later. It is an absolutely beautiful episode. So really, really stunning if you haven't had a chance to see it, or if you don't watch The Magicians, you could even watch this one episode and you might miss some of the context. But again, it's really, really touching. So my second episode is probably one of my favorite series of all times, but I'll get to that. I'm going to talk about Anne with an E, and it's a Netflix original that Netflix did in cooperation with the Canadian Broadcasting Company. And again, we're going to go to season 3, episode 3. I don't know, maybe there's something with seasons 3s and episode 3s. 3 is a magical number, right? And so the title of this episode is What Can Stop the Determined Heart? Quick backstory, and the whole story is a long story, so I am not going to go into the whole story, but I will try to make this as quick as possible. Do watch the entire series if you're inclined, of Anne with an E. I have followed Anne of Green Gables and all of its permutations since I was really young, and I love it so much. It's the girly girl in me. It's been a group of stories so close to my heart. My ancestors, not the Italian side, obviously, are not the Portuguese side either, but the other ancestors are from French Canada, and so it's a really special story for coming from that area. The original stories were written by Lucy Maud Montgomery. And over the years, there have been really a lot of TV shows, books, spin-offs, but this particular one, congratulations Netflix and CBC, I have found to have been an absolutely amazing version. And as a side note, everybody's kind of giving Netflix and CBC some trouble because they decided they don't want to work together anymore to produce any series, and so all of us are left without future seasons of Anne with an E. So boo on all of you. But throughout this story, we're actually not going to talk about Anne, the main character. We're going to talk about a side character named Mary Lacroix. And as the story goes, Mary is newly married. She's a new mother. She has a new home, and life is pretty good. She sadly gets a cut on her hand, and it becomes infected. And this is set in the early 1900s. So obviously there's no medicine that she can take. There's no antibiotics to stop the infection from spreading. And ultimately she gets sepsis. Mary goes to see a doctor, or actually the doctor goes to her technically. And the doctor tells her she's dying. She has a matter of days to weeks, but she will not live beyond 2 weeks. As she grows weaker, she confides in her husband Bash that she's terrified of dying, scared of leaving her family, scared of the unknown. It's absolutely heartbreaking to watch. Her anxiety is palpable, and really good job to actress Kara Ricketts, because her performance was with Mary throughout the series was amazing. But Mary doesn't want to leave the world in sorrow. She's a fighter, and she's always been a fighter. And if you get to know her character, this is really hallmark of her character. But she's unsure at this point of how to live her ending. So 38 minutes in, just about 39 minutes in, her friends and family and community that have always known that Mary is a person of Easter. She is a person of redemption, a sincere lover of God. Her heart was always to have people over for Easter in celebration and in thanks. So she will kind of, throughout the series, she really wants to fulfill this. So her family comes together and they decide to give her Easter celebration. And a neighbor has an outdoor garden. They decorate it beautifully. Everyone is present for the food. And actually the food they make, she's a wonderful cook, and they use her recipes. And they make a booklet for her daughter, who is just an infant, to have later in life of all of her collected recipes. And there's flowers and gifts are given to her daughter Delphine. And Mary is able to sit with her infant daughter, and it's really quite beautiful. And there's smiles, there's moments of happiness, remembrance, and tears, and people are laughing together. And the family comes together to sing Mary's favorite hymn, "It Is Well With My Soul." And cue the waterworks, because if you weren't sobbing already in this episode, if you have any heart in you whatsoever, you better bring that box of tissues, because you are going to cry like a little bee. You know what I'm saying. All right. So Mary says, I don't know how to thank you all. I'll just read my favorite prayer, if that's all right. And Mary choked up. She doesn't make it through the prayer. She lives through the prayer, but she doesn't make it through the prayer in terms of being able to finish it, because she's sad. And so you come to realize, if you know the prayer of St. Francis, that that's the prayer she's reading. And her friends and family step up. They step in to help her. And really, if you don't know the prayer, it never struck me before that it is actually a most appropriate prayer of passing. So I'm just going to read the prayer to you quickly for those of you who are not familiar with it. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. And where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, and it's in pardoning that we are pardoned. and it's in dying that we're born to an eternal life. So really, really beautiful moment of Mary surrounded by her friends. And you come to realize that this isn't just a party for her to make her feel better. They're sending her off. They are they are her loved ones, and they are actually sending her soul off in the most beautiful way possible to be with God. The camera pans away in the end, and you know that Mary has passed on, and she is not in the next episode. Also, kudos for not showing the actual death, because I think it was incredibly effective to have this scene knowing that they're passing her soul on, but not actually having to see a dead body. It was grace-filled, and it was really, really beautiful. So less complicated in plot than the Magician's episode, but really amazing to watch. Mary was filled with the grace of God, love of her friends as she's waiting for death to finally reach her. She was accompanied by so many elements in her life that touched her heart. The hymns, the prayers, the food, the family, the community, the flowers, the garden. That her dark place of anxiety over dying was not gone, because I don't think we can get rid of that. But for that point in time, it was really transformed by her love of life. Similarly to Eliot, who it was her living that made her dying acceptable. She was not alone in death. So Mary found comfort and peace, and all is well with my soul. So as we see, preparation for death, the living part, is the meaningful element of dying. I think some might argue that it's a distraction from dying. You're going to, it's just to pass the time. But in these two examples, I don't feel in my gut that this is the situation. Nor do I think that even the best distractions can take away the fear over impending death. So I don't know what happens when we die. I promise, or I'd share it with you, because, I'm not that awful of a person. But I do know this, that when I look around at those around me and think about the people who have passed on, it was really their love of life that aided them in having such a meaningful death, and ultimately one that kind of eased the anxiety and the darkness and fear that they had over dying. So that's my bit in this.
Awesome.
That's it. See? Silent room.
Thank you. Of course.
I've
been meaning to check out.
Meditatively to what you
Okay. Well, that brings us to about an hour.
Yay.
So that was Death, Part 1. Just like mysticism and several other things, I'm certain we'll circle back and hit other points later on. Is there anything else that anyone wanted to cover before we sign out for the week?
I don't think so. Yeah, we'll be back.
We're like the Terminators. Oh my God. Seriously?
No. If we're going to do that, then for this episode, we have to say, death is but a door, time is but a window. We'll be back.
Yes, absolutely.
Vigo. I hope someone got him a kitten eventually. That's right.
Command me, Lord. Okay, sorry. No more Ghostbusters, people. I promise.
Come on, that was such a great sequel, though.
Oh my gosh, it was the best. Okay, so now we have a Terminator episode that we need to do with a Ghostbusters 2 episode. How do Ghostbusters 2 and Terminator relate?
Yeah.
That's it.
Tune in to find out in the future.
Carpathian sadness. #. Okay. All right then, everyone. Great to have this out to you this week. Join it. Don't forget, join us on social media. Give us a comment. Are we? Is the giveaway still going? We still have that up, Seth?
It's still up. We're picking a winner tomorrow, so.
Ooh, so I better get this up tonight so that I can, maybe some people will get the reminder before we pull the winner. Go check out our Instagram feed and find our giveaway post. Enter for some sweet episode 10 merch. And we will be back with you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.